Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today with Scot Bilbro from Marietta Cellars. We have a long history, actually, between us, though he never knew me back in the day. And you can find Wine Talks on Spotify, Google Play, and all your favorite podcast hangouts, and always sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, where we support the new Pure and Biodynamic Wine Club, where we ship to you organic and biodynamic wines to your door. But I'm just intrigued to have Scot here today, despite my raspy voice, because I just handed him a newsletter from 1990. Where we featured the Marietta Cellars what's it called?
Old Vine Red,
Old Vine
number
Red.
9.
So I want to go back to those days, just even before that. Because I won't ask you how old you are either, so that's okay. Like, how old are you when number 9 came out? But I was reading the newsletter, part of it, I thought, wow, these are all, I think they were sequential, but your dad started this whole thing when?
My dad started Marietta Cellars in 1978, and he made the first Old Vine Red in 1982.
So did he buy raw land, a vineyard? What did he?
No,
was it functioning?
What he first did was he created a brand. He learned how to make wine by working with other winemakers in the area, and then he rented an old cow barn in Dry Creek Valley. He moved barrels in and a couple open-top tanks, and he just started making wine by himself. He was sourcing fruit at that point almost exclusively from old Italian farmers in the area who had an acre or two of essentially forgotten vines, which were usually field blends, and he'd source those little blocks of wine, grapes, ferment them in the barn, and put them together into Old Vine Red. That was really the idea behind Old Vine Red, was that it was a synthesis of different varietals combined to make one wine. That
just seems like a pretty bold thing to bite off. What was he doing before he became a winemaker?
Well, you got to picture my dad, and in those days, long black curly hair, handlebar mustache, looked like a 70s porn star.
Oh, and let me look that up on the web.
Yeah. And so just imagine what you're looking right there on the web with everything longer.
Wow, that's amazing.
And he was believe it or not, a former hospital administrator.
Oh, wow.
And got tired of the bureaucracy and the red tape and ulcers in his early 30s.
What part of town was that?
He was over at the Sonoma Developmental Center, the hospital just outside Sonoma and Glen Ellen.
So always up in Northern California, always. Is that where he was raised too?
Yep, he was born in Cloverdale, on the absolute north end of Alexander Valley.
So totally Northern California, Sonoma side of Northern California.
Yeah, he's a local boy. So we're up in the north end of Sonoma County. We still are. The winery now is in Geyserville. We're about 6 miles from where he was born. His mother was his mother and his aunt were the first set of twins ever born in Cloverdale. So, it's a small town up there.
That's exciting, though.
And his family immigrated to Northern California from Lucca, Italy. So they kind of settled there because it reminded them of where they came from.
Ah, okay. I've heard that before about coming into Sonoma and Napa, that it reminds you of the hometown, or the homeland, so to speak. But it still seems rather risk-oriented, particularly in the 70s, though California wine was sort of getting started in 76, right, because of the Taste of Paris, and Napa was on the map. And Sonoma was a little bit behind that. It's still very rural, but how do you just say, I'm going to buy a barn or just bring some barrels in and just start making some wine?
Well, my pops always had a really strong sense of self, and he just always figured that if he liked something and it worked for him, there'd be enough people out there that would feel similarly. He didn't think that he was going to conquer the world, but he figured that by hard work and doing something true and honest, he'd connect to enough people to make it work, and he turned out to be right. He was bold.
So now at that time, you guys were young and
he had, at that time, or in that neck of the woods, he had 3 young boys. My mom
into trouble.
Well, we were running all around the vineyards and all over the winery and climbing up on the barrels, and my mom was pulling her hair out, being a single mom essentially, while my father was off sourcing grapes, making wine, bottling it by hand, and before the end of the 80s, he's traveling the entire country by himself selling wine.
Wow. So he was marketing, manufacturing,
doing everything,
brokering grapes, he was fermenting,
soup to nuts,
and he was learned it all on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, he had a couple mentors along the way, but he essentially learned it all and honed into his own style. He really did it all by himself until he brought on board Roman Cisneros, who is still our cellar master.
Yes.
He's been our cellar master for 32 years.
Wow.
And
I
so-
remember the name.
Yeah, so my dad and Roman essentially did all of that work for decades and decades and decades, just by themselves, until my brothers and I got involved in the business. I've since taken the Marietta mantle and I'm carrying it forward, and my two brothers are doing their own things in the wine world. But yeah, it's a second generation family wine story.
Had he a passion for wine prior, just or because of his Italian roots, he felt like this was important, or?
Yeah, the winery is named Marietta after his great aunt, Marietta Pardini. So when he was a young boy, his great aunt and great uncle Marietta and Arme essentially raised him. He was the first of many siblings, and by the time the rest of them came along, he was kind of shipped out of the house to his great aunt's house. And at her house, he learned how to garden, how to cook, how to hunt, how to fish. They were the type of family that pickled and canned and really only went to the store for sugar or flour.
Wow.
And that upbringing really taught him about self-sufficiency, how to put flavors together, and just imbued him with this whole Italian culture, which led him down the road to winemaking.
It's, you're looking at this newsletter, folks. I'm just, for the auditeurs here, I found a 1990 newsletter that I wrote. I bought this company in 1988 from my father after he assumed my palate was satisfactory enough to continue. And this was probably one of the first 12 or 14 wines I bought. And it shows at $6. And how much a bottle was this?
Back then, this was $6.69 a bottle.
Yeah. And reorders were $4.99.
That's right.
I mean, and I remember the wine. I totally remember the wine. Wine is there's such a passion about wine when it comes to memory, particularly palates, but I can sense that wine today. I know what I bought. I remember when I bought it, and I remember I was fascinated by the wine. And then you noticed also that, along the way, well, I'm asking this other question. First, at that time in 1990, you think you were making how many cases?
Oh, at that time we were making maybe 12,000 cases of wine a year.
Which is probably in 1978 a fair large.
Yeah, my dad was able to, I think he really struck a chord with people, specifically with Old Vine Red. And around this time, lot 9, 10, 11, 12 started getting a little bit of attention from Robert Parker, and names started to take off, and before we knew it, it was growing. But this is kind of right at the inflection point, right when he really started to get some recognition for what he was doing.
Well, I remember tasting the wine. I remember buying it. I remember the value it represented. I also remember tasting like 6, 7, and 8, or 6 or 7 and 8, and since landing on number 9 just because the timing was right and I thought it was a better vintage. Was that a field blend back then as well?
Yeah, it was still a field blend. It was a field blend essentially through the 90s, and we were lucky enough through the 90s to start having some of our growers approach us and say, hey, we're now second, third generation, and we're moving out of farming. And somewhere in the 90s and into the 2000s, we bought a couple different pieces of property, and now we're estate grown. And every one of the properties that we grow grapes on came from a connection from a former grower.
So field blend being, instead of picking the Cabernet and picking the Zin and picking the Petit Syrah, then bringing it into the winery and handling them differently, and then blending them in the lab afterwards, we pick the grapes that we've grown, and we just throw them into the crusher, and we crush them all together, and we ferment them all together.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, essentially, there's a little bit of debate in terms of where field blends got started, or maybe why. There's some idea, and there's probably some truth to both. There's some idea that back in the day, viticultural science and stringency with plant material wasn't to the point where you could necessarily get an entire field of one clone of one type of grape. And so as you're taking cuttings from different vineyards, you probably had a couple different clones mixed in, some different varietals mixed in. There's another idea that people would specifically mix some in to add complexity to the grape source. And however that came about, what that lends us now, whenever you can work with the field blend, is you get some grapes that are a little bit riper at the time of harvest, some that are a little bit less ripe. You get a couple different grapes in the mix, some that are more tannic, some that have higher acid, and the resulting wine, by picking that entire block of grapes at once and fermenting it together, ends up with higher complexity, more notes, not just fruit, but also savory components, earth components, more floral lift, all these things.
And so it's harder to predict that, though, is it not, when you're picking a field blend? In other words, I'm a winemaker. I've got my Cabernet I have one of my father's graduated cylinders here. He's a pharmacist by trade, a chemist, and I use it to blend. I get barrel samples all the time, and I blend them together. And I take this 100 centiliters of this and whatever. So you have control over what that is. But with a field blend, you don't have as much control.
Yeah, well, you don't have as much control, but you also have experience with that specific block, and you've learned over years how it's going to go together. My father also was working with many different individual field blends, which he would put together. So there's always some blending control there. Nowadays we still have some of those old field blends. We have the Gibson block, which is in the McDowell Valley and includes some of the oldest Syrah and Grenache in the state of California. That is a field blend. We have younger vineyards as well, and we really enjoy taking those different components and working them together. There's always some of that when you're doing something like this, which is kind of a mix between art and science, where it's semi-controlled, shall we say?
Well, I suppose it just hit me. Yes, if I know that this block of Petit Syrah is the same size as the one that we used last year, there's some consistency or some ability to say, okay, I'm going to get this component from the Petit Syrah or from the Zin. I'm going to get this component from the Cab, and so you're just taking the idea of the lab blend back one step.
Yeah.
And doing it in the field. But I talk to a lot of winemakers here. We talk about the phenolic ripeness, and we talk about the work, the winery work, and the different degrees of ripeness, and when you're going to pick. And now with a little bit of global warming, particularly places like Burgundy and Bordeaux, we're starting to see picking 2 weeks earlier. So, and you mentioned it briefly. I want to just take a little further. If I've got an early ripening grape as part of this blend, and I've got a late ripening grape, which can be a few weeks, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have considerably different acid structure and sugar structure between those two grapes.
Yeah, you are, but there's a presumption in there that there's an optimal ripeness. And if you talk to 100 different winemakers, they're all going to give you different optimal ripenesses.
Right.
And so, I know people who pick Zinfandel at 23 bricks, 23% sugar. I know people who pick it at 26. Within a particular varietal, within a particular region, you'll often have a multiple week spread of when people are choosing to pick that grape anyways.
Same neighborhood, same everything.
There's so much personal preference involved in this. One of the nice things about the idea of a field blend is, in any case, whenever you're calling a pick call, we're in harvest right now, so we're calling pick calls right now.
What are you doing down here, by the way? It's harvest.
I'm talking on the radio in studios. This is ridiculous. But in any case, what the whole point is that you get this variety coming into a resultant blend, and that variety itself lends some stability, as opposed to if you're just going for one single block of Zinfandel or one single block of Cab, you're really trying to nail it. And in that case, if you're a little early or a little late, you can tell. With a field blend, you get complexity and you get some stability, which is a nice mix for a winemaker.
So you're not sitting at the dinner table, honey, I can't believe Joe's picking today. This is crazy. I'm not going to pick for another 2 weeks. I
try not to pay attention to Joe. I try not to pay attention to Joe, and
he's a good guy.
Yeah. Well, no, during harvest, we're all talking. I call Joe, I call Morgan, I call my brothers, I call you name it, I call them, and we're chatting and we're all making decisions. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to your vineyard, your kind of natural feel with it, and how much experience you have. I remember when I first started with my dad, whether it was a pick call or in the tasting room with the lab, putting wines together, I was completely over my head and in over my head.
Aren't we all anyway?
Yeah, but I remember just being 100% freaked out and feeling like I'm never going to get this. I'm never going to have the confidence to be able to make one of these decisions. And somewhere 3-4 years in, at some point, I all of a sudden sat down like, I'm making contributions, I'm making decisions, and they're making sense. It's just, you got to ride the horse for a while.
That's pretty cool.
Before you realize you're actually riding the horse.
So no enology school, no UC Davis, no Fresno State?
Davis. I went to Davis, got my degree there in both enology and viticulture, and learned a lot of really important things, which I still put into use today. But, I had a special situation in which not very many people are as fortunate as I am. I went to Davis knowing I was going to come back and work in the family winery. And so I was able to go get a tremendous amount of technical knowledge, and then I was able to come back to the winery and meld it with my father's real world experience and slowly start developing my own real world experience.
Wow,
so
that's pretty fortunate.
Oh yeah, and to be a second generation winemaker and to be taking a brand that's been around for 42 years and moving it into the next millennia,
But you went into it knowing this is what you wanted to do.
I went into Davis thinking I was going to grow grapes and ride on a tractor and have a farmer's tan. And I came out really loving the wine side of it and putting flavors together, and ended up taking over from my pops in that aspect.
I've had a great, this is my 30th year doing this, and the great fortunate to work with my dad. He's 93 now, and he's turning 91 this month. And still sharp as a whip, and we still talk, and his memory of the wine days and where he traveled to is fantastic. But I've had the great opportunity between my siblings, and I've had the brother and sister, to get his wisdom, because we're on the same plane, so to speak. We have the same sense of humor, we have the same sort of work ethic, and I learned from him. But my brother and sister are different. My sister's a judge, my brother lives in Lincoln. So I've really felt honored and privileged to be able to work with my dad. He had that sense when you were...
Oh yeah, I mean, and beyond honored and privileged, 8 years into working with my dad, looking back at myself during my first couple of years working with my dad, I'm thinking, my God, I don't know how my dad had that much patience and bandwidth and grace to put up with me. I come back from Davis thinking I know everything.
Of course.
But no, I mean, he laid out a beautiful path for myself and my brothers, and we're all sort of carrying his winemaking mantle and grape growing mantle out into the world through all three of our different paths now. And I feel very lucky right now, and very lucky that I got as much time with my father as I did. And I'll be, extremely happy if I lead the life in the wine industry that he got to lead.
Well, that's great. That's a great legacy. I'm actually writing. I had a LA Times investigative reporter interview my father and get some of these stories down. Warren Winiarski stayed at our home. I didn't know this when I was a teenager, and Jim Barrett was our neighbor anyway. He used to come in all the time to my dad's shop, and Dave Stair, when he first bought into Dry Creek, didn't know anything. He came to my father and asked him for advice. Yep. Bruce Nyer from Nyer's Vineyards, he used to tell me stories about selling to my father. So I have this wonderful passion for the business side of it, just the history of it. But my passion for the wine itself is relatively new, even though it's 30 years past. And that's why I'm interested about the way you're field blending and the way you're processing your winery now, because there seems to be this movement towards, I'm not going to say natural because I hate that term, but the not picking based on the lab results of the grapes, but picking on the phenolic sort of texture of the grape and the skin thickness and how we're going to determine when we're going to pick. Those kinds of things seem to be evolving. Biodynamic wines, organic wines, fine and dandy. But I think the whole objective is to get into a more complex, a more expressive, a more terroir-driven, all the things that we want to get out of a glass of wine when we taste it.
Yeah, well, when I came back from Davis, I was ready to go. I had a list of all the stuff I needed to create my lab at the winery. I had all my statistical tests laid out for my sensory experiments I was going to do on our wine, and I talked to my dad and I said, where's all your lab equipment? And he said, I got a pH meter. And I looked and it was up on the shelf, and I don't think he'd ever used it
dusty.
in 10 years. Yeah. But that was one of the great things I got to learn. Like I said, I still use a lot of what I learned at Davis, and it's very important technical knowledge. But when my dad set out to make wine, and specifically set out to make Old Vine Red, one of his stories about his inspiration was sitting down with his great aunt Marietta and making minestrone with her, and they sat down and she starts cooking and he wants to learn how to make it. So, she says, well, you get out the garlic and you take the kidney beans, and he starts writing down this much of this, and she goes, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I'm writing down the recipe. And she grabs his little notepad and throws it across the room. She goes, you don't write that stuff down. And not because it's a secret. She goes, it's never the same. She goes,
Yeah.
next time you might not have as many kidney beans, or you might have old garlic, or, you know, it might not be in season, but you're still going to make a soup. And so you're going to have to be light on your feet and change what you're doing. And that's what
What a great lesson.
Yeah, and that's what he learned as a winemaker, and that's what he's taught to me. And I think that's kind of what is at the heart of the type of winemaking you're talking about. You know, I mean, we own our own vineyards, we farm them with our own people, we do all our own winemaking, we have our own bottling, and it's just about being connected to the source and allowing yourself to be intuitive and to feel it and to trust your gut, and to kind of roll with it as it goes along, because it's never the same year in, year out.
That's an interesting point, and I keep bringing it up, and probably my listeners are tired of hearing about it, but I think it's really, really important, and that is the passion for wine and the passion for the grape is so much different than any other. You can't do this with an apricot, you can't do it with a radish, you can't do it with the only thing I can think of that represents where it's from as much as wine might is a car. Like a 58 Maserati or something.
Yeah, you got to feel there, don't it?
Right. I mean, you have to love the car, you have to love the mark. But wine, there's something ethereal about the grape that represents its soil, that represents where it's from, and represents the winemaker's influence, and represents all the things that you're just talking about, and your ability to intuitively understand what it's bringing to you.
Well, isn't it funny that California, you know, the United States came up with California wine and muscle cars?
Yeah.
You know? There's something
some
in
of the
there.
wines are like that too.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
true.
Yeah, no, I think there's, you know, when you're dealing with a winery that's hands-on, winemakers that are hands-on, grape growers who are in the field, there's a different feel, you know. And I you mentioned natural wine, and I hate words like terroir. You know, it's just these words get so much stuff imbued in them that they get really heavy, and a lot of
That's
content
true.
that's not necessarily always true.
Yeah.
But what's important for me is when I meet someone in this industry or in any industry who's just so connected to it that they've got a feel for it. And, you know, usually what I find, especially when you have an industry like this where you're dealing with site-specific things, and you can put somebody on top of that who has a feel for it, you get a beautiful expression.
Yes.
And it's a unique expression, you know, whether it's theirs, whether it's the site, whether it's all of a piece, I don't really care. As long as it's beautiful and interesting and you get to hear about it and get to experience it, you know, I think that having that brought into your life, having a beautiful custom crafted car brought into your life, you know, these are all good things.
You know, you brought up your Italian culture, but I want to, what you just mentioned, I was going to talk about Italian food in a second. But you think about the monks of Burgundy, 12th century, 13th century, and they understood what they were being delivered.
Yeah.
You know, they understood that Gevrey-Chambertin was different from its neighboring vineyards. And that came without technology, and that came without all the things we have today to go with. It came from intuition and the love of the grape and the passion to get out of the soil the most that you can and make the best wine that you can from it. That being said, you mentioned your aunt, the name of this wine after your aunt. And she obviously was a fine cook, and your dad learned how to cook from her. Tell me about what you think the evolution of, and I just finished a book called The Last Days of Haute Cuisine in America, which is written by a guy named Patrick Hugh. He was the Los Angeles Magazine food writer for 17 years. Wrote a great book on the history of cuisine in America as society dictated what it should be like. But California doesn't have, we don't have indigenous grapes, right? When they try to prove it, Zin was, but it's not. So we had this luxury of being able to produce our own cuisine from what we're given in the soil to match the wine. So, but your dad had a better experience. He had an aunt that was making Italian food. Is that the source of these wines' character in the beginning? To pair up with your aunt's food, so to speak?
Yeah, I think the spirit is the source. That looseness, the ability to move, the ability to improvise. You know, when you take that, which is what you find in a great kitchen, I think, which is also what I think is important in a great winery. If you take that and you marry it with a culture that's tied to a place, that's a really good mix, because then you've got the place which is steady and is giving you something replicable, and you've got something else on top of it, a person an entity, an organization, a group of employees like we have, that then is able to take something steady and move with it and continue to evoke it. I think, go back to the 12th century and monks, there's a lot of experience there. These things don't just happen overnight. It takes some sort of a continuity in one space. And, regionalism is important if you're going to actually evoke something different, and it takes time to evolve from that one location. So, we're kind of a transplant, in this beautiful pamphlet that you gave me, it just said, Old Vine Red has a striking resemblance to the wines of Tuscany.
Oh, there you go. Where was she from?
Yeah, she's from Lucca.
Oh, there you go.
and if you taste Old Vine Red today, it's still got a lot of acid for a red blend in today's California market, because that shines through and that feels right to us because that's where our roots are from. But I think that taking that in this world and having people who aren't just following a broader market trend and are sticking with something that they know, whether it's from their cultural perspective or whether it just feels right to them, I think that's rare, and I think it's really important because, I think about cuisine that way. If everybody was just copying the same trends, I don't want to go out and eat.
No.
I want something
anyway.
No. So
I'm so tired of DoorDash. I can't tell you. That's driving me crazy.
Well, I live in the country, so it's a little different. It takes them a long time to get to me.
It's the worst. Well, that's the interesting thing is it's sort of in its own way. Your father's history and your aunt's cooking, and they're from Tuscany, and the wine evolved that way. At least in 1990, when we wrote the story, it sort of felt like this is where it belonged. In California, having no history in cuisine, that may be the background for your dad's palate, and the background for what he was producing had something to do with the food he was eating from his aunt.
And I think there's a whole movement in there in food right now. You look at it, food and wine. People are getting back connected to things that are made by people's hands that they know, and in our area, it's like, it's not the over-processed food with the squiggle on top. It's the rough cut stuff that comes from the field next to you. It's the farm to table. It's the connectivity. And, I'm just pleased that my dad never moved away from what he was doing and actually handed it to me right on time. So, through no fault of my own, no doing of my own, I'm on trend.
Can't take any credit for that now, can you?
I can't. I won't.
It's interesting, the cuisine part. I had Joachim Splichau in here, the famous chef from LA, and he was saying, in the 70s when I worked in Nice, we would go to the market every morning and we would buy the vegetables for that service, and we didn't cut a thing until it was ordered.
Yeah.
And same with the fish. We'd go to the Nice wharf and we'd buy these fresh fish, and so this nouvelle cuisine idea is not so new. It just seems to repeat itself.
With my wines, I often describe my wines as modern expressions of traditional varietals. And it's funny because when I say modern, I mean it's a Zinfandel like a Zinfandel you would have gotten in the 80s,
Right. Which
you just have to go back a little ways.
Pretty brash.
And they were, well, in this case, it means a little higher acid. It means not as much use of new oak. It means no residual sugar, and so it's got some layers and it's got some acid and it's got some different things. It works with food. So I think, none of this is new. It's just a recycling to the 70s to the 80s. And, sometimes we move away from things and we realize, whoa, we shouldn't have moved away from that. And thank goodness we can reconnect.
There's a movement. There's my side of it. You're talking about the direct-to-consumer side, which is a very specific part of the wine business. You must have a club at Marietta that people that just enjoy your wines, they receive them. My dad started this whole industry in 1972. He's the first guy to ever do it. And unfortunately, we don't get a percentage of this $3 billion industry, but we take whatever we can get. But the point being, there's a lot of new businesses. I mean, I can't believe how many show up. Okay, I mean, I had one the other day. I found it where you send in a swab of your saliva, and based on your DNA, they're going to match wines for you.
Yep.
Okay, I mean, how absurd is that? Okay,
you don't need to have any choice or any involvement at all.
No, that's right. It's already matched up. It's just perfect for you. You're going to have to like it because it's your DNA.
Next thing you know, they just put it on a little thing on your shoulder and it'll go right into your veins via IV. No choice required. No participation.
But what we've seen is what's happening, and that's what I'm really happy to have you here and talk about these wines since we have history. But they're bringing in these 50,000 gallon bladders of crap, and they sugar it up here in America. There's even a path for it. It comes into Newark, New Jersey, goes up the coast of New York. There's a big facility up there. It gets bottled in a variety of names, and it gets pumped into the marketplace. It's on Groupon 3 for $45 for 15 wines, and it's killing the. I think it's killing the palate of the American consumer right now because it's just sugared up junk. I mean, bad. It's really bad. And a lot of people, like for instance, you might join one of, I'm not going to name any names, that's not the way I do business, but if you join one of these clubs, you may get a Sangiovese, Italian Sangiovese. And if you join the other club, you're going to get the same one. It's got a different brand name on it. It's got the same, everything's the same. And because of that, I'm seeing now tons of volume coming from legit wineries. We're making legit wines going, we've got overstock because there's just too many things out there going on. And I believe the consumer's going to figure this out. Yeah. They're going to be tired of just buying. I'm getting to this point. I am getting to a point. Don't worry.
I'm a patient man.
That the experience in wine is not, hey, I shared this with my friend because I got it for $3.
Yeah.
That's not an experience for wine. The experience is that story that you see on the page written in 1990. The experience is the fact that you do a field blend still, and what an interesting concept, and what I feel when I do that. Because I think wine should make you feel something, not just a buzz, which is a great byproduct.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that we moved away from in this industry, and I feel like we're moving back towards it, is wine education. And I think the trick is find your trusted wine source, find somebody who talks to you and gives you good information, and try things and keep going back to the things you like. But it should be something that is accessible to you in a way that you can actually connect to it. Mm-hmm. So whether it's your neighborhood store or whether it's Wine Talks, it's something that's been there for a while where you can connect to a person and you can trust them, and you can develop your own experience over time to start making your own little matrix in your head of what you like and what you don't like, and developing that experience. If you're just going to go off your DNA swab or whichever website gives it to you at the biggest discount or whatever, you are not engaging. And if you're not engaging, you're not going to get the best experience out of this whole possible set of experiences.
That was well said. That was well put. Because the other one is, you get on the site and they say, do you drink black coffee, and do you salt your food, and do you like raw mushrooms? And then we're going to build a palate. And you and I know how complicated the palate is, and almost random sometimes, and how it changes even throughout the day. That algorithm has to fail, right? There's no way, right?
Well, and above and beyond the algorithm failing, if you've been on vacation and absolutely fallen in love with a wine, then you brought it home and it's not the same wine.
Yeah.
Context is so much in life.
My favorite story.
Yeah. Context is so much in life. And so you need the context of the wine. You need who made it, where did it come from, how did they grow it, what's their history. You need the context of who you buy it from. All of these things kind of feather in around that bottle of wine to give you some context. And, you certainly develop your preferences. But if it were just that easy, I would have stuck with statistics.
Yeah, well, yeah, which is what my major was. Actually, you said that's very funny, because I've had this happen at least 3 times, and I'll shorten the story. But somebody goes to Italy, they taste this wonderful Sangiovese, but they happen to be sitting in front of the Parthenon with a pizza at their favorite, cafe, and they come home and I get it for them, same vintage, same everything. Doesn't taste the same, Paul. I'm like, well, yeah, because you're here in America with stress and the kids are pulling on your shirt tail. You're not in front of the Parthenon, and it's a different experience. The whole thing is an experience.
Yeah, you got Jerry Springer blaring in the background.
Yeah, right.
You're trying to get dinner together, and you're drinking this wine that you enjoyed in completely different circumstances.
Which kind of leads me to the idea that you mentioned you don't like the word terroir. Terroir being, the general gist of the weather and the soil and everything that happened during that vintage. But I think that goes further than that, and includes the winemaker and their philosophies and the things that are going on in their lives and the things that are going on in their career into making wines that are to be enjoyed.
Yeah, I like the idea of terroir. The problem is I don't like how kind of fancy and highfalutin it's gotten.
Mm-hmm, that's true.
I think what it comes down to is connecting to something real. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, and unfortunately these days there's a lot more ways to not connect to something real. So, whether it's putting down your cell phone, whether it's turning off the TV, whether it's going out in your backyard, it's about getting yourself set on this earth and giving yourself the opportunity to connect to something real out of a bottle of wine with your family, with a friend. And I guarantee if you have the same wine outside on your patio with your family, it's going to taste a hell of a lot better than it would inside with the TV on. So.
And as well as with the proper glass, right?
Yeah.
There's a diner right down the street called Leroy's, okay? And I'll never forget, I had a vendor come, he's an older guy, he's a good friend, and he brought me some Columbia, David Lake's wine at the time when he was alive, and, master of wine, making wine. And here we are in this diner with these amber tumblers, the plastic amber tumblers, tasting these exquisite wines. I'll never forget that experience.
So as I travel around, whenever I see my wine on a restaurant list, I always get it, and it's kind of a boring thing for a winemaker to do. I don't get it because I want to buy wine to show them I'm supporting it. I want to try all those other wines on the list, but I always get at least one glass of my wine because I want to see what my wine tastes like out of a completely different glass on the other side of the country.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Because it's like, okay, this is a thick-walled glass, this is a tumbler, this is whatever it is, or in this case, they give you a small pour. In this place, I've been in places where, it's a thick-walled glass and they fill the glass almost all the way up to the top. I can't even get my nose in it.
It matters, though.
It matters.
It totally matters.
And I want to see what the experience is out there for my end consumer. And it's really revelatory in terms of, feeds all the way back to my winemaking.
Absolutely. Well, and that becomes, you're not using the falutin of terroir, because I think terroir, the idea, is a very important part of winemaking. But the idea that it's served properly in the right glass, and food matters, right? I have this experiment I do with a lot of customers and my staff, which is a raw cucumber with the skin on. And it's the most influential thing I think I've been able to come up with on my own, where you try to explain how important food relates to wine when you're tasting it and how much it can change your palate. And a cucumber, for whatever chemicals are in the skin, dramatically change from one sip to the other when you do that. It's a great experiment. So you're going back to your family. Your brothers, you have two other wineries in the family.
Yeah, my older brother has Limerick Lane Cellars, which is just south of Healdsburg. You can look them up online and go visit them.
Lane.
Limerick Lane. Beautiful zins.
Like there was a man from Nantucket kind of thing?
Yeah, I'll let you finish that one. I'll let you finish that one.
There's a shirt you can buy when you go to Nantucket that says, "I'm the man from Nantucket."
Yeah, so extra points if when you make an appointment and go to his tasting room if you're wearing that shirt.
Okay, right.
And my younger brother has a winery called Idlewild, which is up in Sonoma County as well, and he focuses on Italian varietals, especially from Piedmont, that are grown in Northern California. And so it's interesting, my brothers, both of them, and I have all taken different pieces of my father's legacy and are evolving it and invoking it in our own ways.
Speak to him daily?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a chat, like a text string?
No, we haven't been the best texters, but I'm lucky. I get to see my younger brother lives right next door to me, literally. And so, if I don't speak to him, I like to, throw things like a tomato down the hill at him. And I see my older brother, super frequently. So yeah, no, it's great. We're all learning from each other continually about winemaking as well, because it's one of the nice things as we're all, blazing our own paths in different directions. It's great to jump across to each other's winery and taste what they're doing and how they're doing it and why, and it's kind of what it's all about.
Well, this industry never stops. You never stop learning. I've taken it upon myself the next couple of years to really just not wine geek it out, but just gain more knowledge. I want to know more knowledge. People expect me to know more when I'm entertaining. Nothing's worse than getting the wine list with 12 people at the table, because you're not going to please all the palates, and they're all expecting you to produce something. Kevin knows this as well. You just you have to really give it to this guy. And let him blow it. Yeah.
Well, get a couple bottles, that helps.
Yeah, right. But we're always learning something. It's a fascinating industry. It doesn't change. It changes constantly, and not the least of which is the consumer trends and the consumer palate changing as often as it does.
Well, you take the most experienced person out there who knows as much as is possible about wine, and put them, let's say, right here, Southern California today, and put them back right here in Southern California 6 months from now. I guarantee it's a different
It's
wine
gonna be different.
landscape. So, you gotta keep up with it. And that's good. Otherwise we'd all be bored.
Tell me about just quickly, well, we've got a few more minutes. The you said there's no sugar in any of these wines.
Nope.
Sulfur content?
Yeah, we use sulfur at the crush pad. We use a little bit of sulfur throughout the aging process, just
Like 30 parts, 40, 50
to protect the wines. 30 at crush. So, one of the funny things about sulfur is it's in almost everything naturally.
It is.
And if you ever had raisin bran or you've had any dried fruit, like a dried apricot, those things are coated in sulfur.
Right. 2 eggs is like
yeah.
75 parts.
Yeah, it's just a natural preservative, and it occurs naturally, and it's added. So yes, we use it a little bit as an antioxidant. But we what's in my bottles in front of us here is grapes and made into wine, and a little bit of sulfur to protect. And that's it.
So what is unnatural about that, by the way? That's what the part, and I wrote an article on LinkedIn about natural wine. It's like, what is unnatural about putting a vine in the ground and watering it and then fermenting it? I mean, how is that unnatural? If you're doing it without, well, I've known guys that put color in it and stuff like that, but other than that, what's unnatural about it?
Natural is another word like terroir that's gotten its own connotation. This is natural wine. You can also go further afield into the natural wine realm, and you can get orange wines, and you can get skin fermented whites, and you can get whites that don't have sulfur, and it's all interesting. And you can have a lot of fun doing all of that. I think it's just about staying open and exploring and trying a whole bunch of different things. There's a time for me to have a skin fermented white, and there's a lot of times for me not to have a skin fermented white. One of my best friends gave me great advice once as I'm trying a skin fermented white that was kind of more towards room temperature. And I'm like, man, I just can't get behind this. I can't quite figure it out. And he said, well, close your eyes and just take all context away from what you're drinking.
That's a really good advice.
Just taste it and see if you like it or not.
That's really good advice.
Sometimes it's a good thing to try is just evaluate it on its own merits and then put it back into its context and see if it still holds true for you.
Well, I've had, as in any other wine, I've had huge spectrums of orange wines too, which I think is a bad name for the thing, because rosé is basically the red wine made in it's the opposite. So why we have to come up with a wine that's orange and people think it's orange? Maybe the color is sometimes orange, but I've had really rustic, difficult to drink. Like you can't enjoy this, but you're drinking it because you think you're doing yourself a favor. To really nice, fine, orange wines. In fact, the last ones I had were from Slovenia. They were gorgeous wines. So they have their place, I think, in the palate of wine consumption, depending on what you're eating or what you're doing. But I'm having a hard time personally with these really rustic. I don't have a problem with the biodynamic movement. I think it's a great movement. But when you're just going back into time and trying to and making these things that are just like, okay, I get it, they're rustic, they taste like hay, but I really can't enjoy this despite its quote-unquote health benefits, if there are any.
I think for me, biodynamic, natural, rustic, whatever, they can all be interesting, they can all have their place. What I think is interesting is when you find any wine, whichever category it falls into, that within its little realm of the wine world shows that it's somewhat reproducible. What I can't really get behind is a wine where you taste it once and it presents one way, and you taste it a year later, the next vintage, and it's a completely different wine, not in a good way. I feel like natural wine, biodynamic wine, whatever, there's an art, there's a science, there's hard-won experience there, and there are people out there who can make excellent wine year in, year out in all those wine realms. Again, find someone you trust. There are some people, whether it's Napa Cab or natural wine, who are popping up as we speak. It doesn't mean they know how to make wine.
No. Welcome to my world, Scott. That's what I get every day.
I don't know if I envy your palate after all the abuse it must see.
My dad taught me, taste it all, even if it smells like you're not going to like it, because how are you going to learn from the flaws? And I tasted. I often tell the vendor, look, I think you better, before you take this any further, you better taste it yourself, because it's bad. But I find that the movement is interesting. I think there's validity in the biodynamic movement, and I think you're right. Void of, at the expense of all else, I think it's a mistake in the sense of you're just going to throw stuff out. And I use this story all the time. The listeners are probably tired of hearing about it. My daughter, who's a baking chef in New York, took me to Brooklyn, took this to the natural wine shop, bought this near Davila, unpalatable. Yeah. Current vintage, everything was fine. The wine was not off in the sense of like a bad bottle. It was just unpalatable wine. And she said, "But it's natural." I'm like, "Well, I don't care. I want to enjoy it."
Yeah. Well, I think experiments are really interesting, and they're an important part of any field. But that doesn't mean that I want to taste all of your experiments, let alone buy them.
Yeah, buy them, right? Because you spend a lot of money doing it.
Yeah.
So what's next for Marietta Cellars?
Well, I get back to the winery, finish out harvest. It's a beautiful October right now. The weather's starting to cool down a little bit. Nights are getting cold. We're done with rosé, or we're done with Zin. Pretty much done with Syrah. We're moving into cabs and can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Any projects that you're just playing with, odd lots, things you're trying to blend up?
I play with odd lots every year.
Yeah.
I mean, we know we've got some really old Grenache Gris that we're playing with.
Wow.
Has its own separate rosé. We played with some of that where we press it really fast and turn it into a white, which is fun. I mean, it's like you said, orange wine.
Yeah.
It's like, so if you take Grenache Gris and you just press it quick enough, you don't get any color, and it's essentially a white wine.
Wow, that's interesting.
I've been playing with that.
Rhone varietals.
Yeah, well, McDowell Valley, which is our largest vineyard, we were lucky enough to take over stewardship of it in 2012 from the Crawford family. It's an amazing Rhone-focused ranch. It's part of the resurgence of the Rhones in the 90s. And, on that property is where we have the Gibson Block, which is some of the oldest Syrah and Grenache in the country. And, it's a really interesting vineyard in that it's quite far inland, and so it gets really warm during the day. But it's surrounded by the Mayacamas Mountains and the foothills on the other side, and so it acts as a heat sink. And so it gets really warm, and then it gets really cold, which gives you perfect winemaking conditions for acid retention, for flavor precursors, for color development. Frequently, we'll have during harvest 98-degree days, and we'll have 38-degree nights.
Wow, 60-degree swing.
That's a big swing.
I remember the wines well. We featured a handful of them. They're pretty extracted, pretty full wine, so that's a pretty cool place to be able to farm from.
I would imagine you have some other
I have some
pamphlets
newsletters for sure.
McDowell as well. Actually, just out in your lobby, I took a picture you had a whole collection of labels on your wall, and there's a McDowell label right on there. So.
That's what you get when you have an intern in the office and you have nothing for them to do.
I love it.
You give them the label and say, make a collage for it.
Thank you, intern. I took a picture.
Hey, Scott, it's been a great pleasure having you here on Wine Talks. So we look forward to having you back. And we're going to taste some wines now. And I wish you luck in this harvest and the coming years. And when we're up in that area, we're going to come see you.
Come through. Thank you for this. I will share it with my brothers. It's one of my great joys, and I know theirs as well, as we go out in this wine world. We continue to find little pieces of our Father out there all over where he did something meaningful.
That's
so thank
great.
you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you.